We'll start the symposium with a talk by Dr. Felicia Cohen, who is Director of Medical Ethics here at UCI. She received her doctorate and master's in religious ethics with an emphasis in bioethics from the University of Virginia. She advises the various liaisons here in the hospital about the ethical issues that are involved in patient care. She will frame in general ethical terms and start as a discussion for before we go into more of the medical details and so forth. And we'll sort of sandwich the symposium with a general ethical discussion before and one at the end, so we can kind of keep in context and not get lost just in the medical world here, but that we're in the big world. Felicia?
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me. Are my slides ready? Not the right ones. While they are looking for them, I'll tell you what I'm going to do this morning. And they asked me to come speak, and I thought, well, there are so many issues. But rather than going into the issues, I'm going to try to help frame the issues for you so that you will have a basis for discussion. So I want to talk about some tools for ethical decision-making, review some ethical principles, guidelines, existing codes as background information that you can use in that discussion, and then identify questions for further discussion that I believe Dr. Kalichman will take up at the end of today's session. There they are. So those were the objectives I just reviewed. And it's always helpful, I think, to start with a definition, because ethics is one of those words we throw around like we know what it means. And I'm not always certain, I'm definitely sure that my medical students don't know, and I'm not always certain that the rest of us do either. So I wanted to start with a short definition. Ethics or morality, which actually may mean different things, but I'm going to use interchangeably for purposes of today, really is the concern with right conduct, belief system, or judgments. So it's about right and wrong. It answers these two questions. What should I do? And that's the right or wrong, good or bad, and most often better or worse kind of question. But more importantly, in my mind, it answers the why should I do it question. So really, anytime you ask a question that involves the word should or ought, you're asking an ethical question. Now, there are three features to ethics or morality. First of all, it's prescriptive. That is, it tells us what to do. Second of all, it is authoritative, meaning it tells us we have to do it. And finally, it's relational, meaning it tells us how to interact with others, because really it wouldn't matter if we were all alone on the planet. Now, I note here that personal morality may conflict with professional ethics. And I think that's a very important point to remember, because we often confuse the two. Often our personal desires, our dreams and goals, interfere with our professional conduct, whether we're willing to admit that or not. Sometimes it's just a matter of, I'd like to make a little more money, and that might result in my not providing the best patient care. So it's a personal interest. Nobody can blame you for it, but it still might conflict with your professional obligations. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, although I believe we'll be focusing mostly on the professional conflicts involved. Is it good practice or not to get involved with industry? There's just so far you can go with ethics, and then the real world kicks in. This is a lot of people's view of ethics. One, of course, I take issue with, having spent my life on it. And it really relates to my pet peeves. A lot of people think ethics is just individual opinion, just common sense. I hear this from my students and house staff all the time. We just have to agree to disagree because we're not going to come up with a good answer. And sometimes that's the case. We have to agree to disagree, but not until we've really worked through the reasons behind the opinions that we hold. It's not enough to just say, I think blue is a better color than red. You have to explain to me why. You have to be able to support that if you're challenged on your opinion. It's not just your gut reaction. So the study of ethics is really an effort to move beyond your gut, move beyond your instincts, to figure out why you believe what you believe and if you can support it. Another pet peeve of mine is the conflation of ethics with law. While I think it'd be really nice if our law always reflected ethics, that's certainly not the case. And you can look at yesterday's Supreme Court decision on gun control as one very good example of that. Many of us will take issue with, if not the whole opinion, at least parts of it. So it's not necessarily reflective of ethics. And ethics in our culture can vary greatly. The law, I would note, also has a lot of gray areas, but it's tend to be read as a lot more black and white. Ethics deals with the more important nuances. And again, the reason giving, which is the most important part. It's not just enough to say, this is right or wrong, this is what you have to do. You have to explain why. Now, there are lots of types of ethical conflicts, and I think it's important to frame our discussion by thinking about these. First of all, there's a conflict or uncertainty over facts involved. For example, the impact of marketing on physician behavior. That's highly contested, despite lots of evidence that suggests there is a great deal of impact on even carrying a pen with a brand name drug in your pocket. And the effects of industry employment. How does that really affect our behavior? We tend to think of ourselves as bastions of objectivity, and the studies show that's not the case. There's also an issue of conflicts over competing interests. Additional income or the best products or medications for patients, for example. And a third type of conflict is the uncertainty about ethical norms. What is it I'm required to do? Be loyal to my patients, loyal to my contractor? What constitutes a patient benefit? What counts as being honest? What constitutes a lie? What are the norms that I'm required to live up to in my professional role? And we have to think about those norms in terms of their meaning, the extent of the obligation, and how we prioritize the different norms that we perceive to exist for our professional role. Now, an ethical dilemma, of course, is the worst-case scenario of these kinds of conflicts. Now, in an ethical dilemma, we are faced with a situation that involves a difficult or persistent moral problem in which two or more moral actions, and important to note, two or more moral actions, may conflict, can be supported, are equally unsatisfactory, meaning there's no clear answer, and are without conclusive evidence favoring one position or another. And that's especially important in these days of evidence-based medicine. We want evidence for everything, but in terms of ethical behavior, we're just not going to get that evidence most of the time. And as I noted before, this is distinguished from a personal dilemma, which is nonetheless a dilemma, but that's not quite the same as an ethical dilemma. You may have a conflict between two ethical obligations, providing the best, what you perceive to be the best care for a patient versus respecting a patient's autonomous wish, versus a personal dilemma in which you just think the patient's choice is wrong. You would never withdraw life-sustaining treatment from a patient, for example, because you think it's wrong to take food and water away from a patient. But medically, that's the best option. That's more of a personal dilemma. But they infringe, as you could see, on your professional conduct. So this is what an ethical dilemma feels like. Don't know, stop, go, slow down. What do you do? And that's where ethical analysis can really help. Now, all ethical analysis is a way of organizing your thinking about an issue. It's not rocket science, and for those of you who are clinicians, you might even recognize this kind of critical thinking pattern. First thing you do when a patient comes in and says, my stomach hurts, you don't assume that the patient ate something and you tell them to go home and take some Tums. First thing you do is ask questions. What kind of pain? How does it hurt? Does it hurt when I touch it here? Where does it radiate to? You ask a bunch of questions, and that's what you do in ethical analysis. Gather all the relevant information from all perspectives. And some of the relevant information here is going to be medical information, marketing data, patient values, clinician judgments, rights, laws, policies, professional duties, other contextual factors. Once you have all the information you can find, then you can identify the problem. We tend to jump to that step first. And I get paged for ethics consults all the time, and the physician who pages me will often define the problem for me. But when I get into the situation and gather the information, I find the problem is really something entirely different. So I would caution you to make sure you have the information before you can really define what the problem is, or problems. That is what I call the moral diagnosis. Identify the problem, the conflicts, or the values at stake. Once you do that, you can identify options for addressing that problem. But I would suggest you do that with a number of things in mind. First of all, what are your goals to be achieved? What are we trying to do here today? What outcomes do we want from this meeting? Are there analogous situations in the past? Precedents, paradigm cases that we can use? Kind of like what the Supreme Court does do. Draw on the past to inform the present and future. And then what ethical theories, values, or norms can we draw on to inform our decision making? And I'm going to go into a little bit about those. And we want to develop guidelines. And for me, the question we ask there is, what is the best thing we can do? What's the best we can do? And notice I didn't say what is the right thing to do, because I think this wouldn't be an ethical dilemma if the right was that clearly defined. We have to determine what's better, what's best, of the options we have available to us. And then, once we're done, we go back and evaluate, are the guidelines working? Do we need to fix them? What have we learned? What opportunities did we miss that made this situation come up in the first place? Now, some of the background information that I think we need, that we should be gathering during this meeting today. Identify the problems and questionable behavior. What actually constitutes a conflict of interest? What are we worried about? The history of the problem, because this is not new. Definitely precedes the Bayh-Dole Act. What is the extent of the problem, both the magnitude and the severity? How big and how strong? The persons involved, so not just clinicians, but the public, the patient. Who else? The effects, both the known and what we might start thinking about as unknown or hidden effects. Similar situations, are there analogies we can draw on? And guidance from others, laws, policies, and guidelines. Now, I mentioned that ethical theories can serve as tools. And if you think about what, any of you who've read philosophy, what each of the philosophers and theological thinkers has done over time is really to reflect on how we think, how we make decisions, and try to codify that into a theory, to explain, really, human behavior. Here's how we determine right from wrong, good from bad, depending on which philosopher you read. And fortunately for us, these theories tend to correspond to components of moral action, or components in grammatical sentences. First is the act-based theories. These are deontological theories. And these kinds of theories suggest that we ask, what would I want done in all similar situations? This notion of universalizability. Would I suggest that everybody behave this way under similar circumstances? What is my duty? As a professional, as a physician, what is my duty? What am I obligated to do? Second set of theories correspond to consequences. These are consequential theories. Situationism, for example, or utilitarianism. And that's where you think about what is likely to happen with various courses of action. This can often lead to the ends justify the means sort of thinking, which isn't necessarily bad. It's important to consider consequences, though they don't necessarily tell the whole story. The third kinds of theories are intent-based. These are teleological theories, where you look at the ends. What do you want to have happen or intend? And that's different from the consequential theories because, as we all know, often what we intend to have happen is not what actually occurs. So we need to look at the intent behind theories, behind the guidelines that we might promulgate. Is the intent good? Will it result in good consequences, most likely? And then the final set of theories is agent-based. These are virtue theories, where we look at what counts as a good nurse or, physician or healthcare professional. What constitutes my role? What makes me a good actor in this role? What makes me a good person? And when we justify decisions, we have to figure out, did I make the best choice? And to do that, we can look at a number of criteria. Was the course of action I chose necessary? Must we infringe on some of the other values involved with this course of action to reach our intended goal? Is this a necessary course of action? Second, effectiveness. Will what I've chosen to do actually work? Is it likely to work? Third, proportionality. How important is the goal I prioritize? Remember, we're going to be choosing one goal over others, one value over others. Is that the most important one? Is it the least infringement possible of those other goals and values? Is the action designed to minimize the infringement? Or am I unjustly imposing on other values, principles, courses of action? And the proper process. Has the decision been made using the appropriate process? Was it fair? Did everybody have a voice? If we didn't all agree, did we at least all get our voices heard? Now I'll throw out one more definition of value because I'm going to offer some of those next. The definition of a value is fairly simple. It's just something that we think is important. We tend to make more of it, but that's really all a value is. They can rise to the level of principles or standards. They can become ideals accepted by some groups, and that's what Dr. Rosen is hoping we'll come up with today. But really, it's just a matter of what's important. Now, these I'm not going to go over, but I offer them as background, and I'm told there are some sets of my slides available that we can use for reference later. These questions have been addressed, so we're not the first group to do it. We probably won't be the last. The American Medical Association has a code of ethics that offers many values that are related: competence, honesty, respect, freedom. And they have specifically, and the American Board of Internal Medicine offered a physician charter that many other medical societies have signed on to that place primacy of patient welfare, patient autonomy, and social justice as the highest or most important values to be achieved, all of which I think have a role here. And as an example, many medical societies have taken that AMA Code of Ethics and developed something similar. I pulled out the Orthopedic Surgery Code simply because they were sponsoring the conference. But I think they speak similarly to other professional societies as well. And these are some of the values that they promulgate: primacy of the physician-patient relationship, integrity, focus on legalities and honor, conflict of interest avoidance, confidentiality protection, medical knowledge, lifetime pursuit of, cooperation, remuneration, publicity, and social responsibility. Now, in addressing conflicts of interest, I think the best we can do is be prepared to handle it, to try to avoid the trap. And the medical societies have again spoken here. The AMA offers a specific statement saying we really shouldn't be getting embroiled in these conflicts of interest. And they've laid out this lengthy set of guidelines for just how to navigate those waters. Now, those have been adapted into specific questions, say regarding inappropriate gifts, as well as industry relationships that I think can inform our discussion here as well. And again, pulling out the Orthopedic Surgeon Academy, they have also addressed, and often adapting the AMA standards, the same kinds of questions. And they've said things like the physician-patient relationship is the central focus. We can't lose sight of that. And we need to focus on confidentiality, trust, and honesty. And they have further looked at conflicts of interest specifically, looking at patient best interests, obligations to disclosure, obligations to accommodate patient needs. Now, the first question for me is, if all these other organizations have done this work already, what do we find unsatisfying or unhelpful about those codes and guidelines? Why aren't those enough? Why is it still a problem? Is it simply human nature that we can't avoid the temptation? Or is there something more? So I think there's some questions we need to focus on today. What impact do industry relationships have on clinician behavior? It's one of those fact-gathering pieces that we need to start with. What is actually the problem? What is the risk of bias? Assuming that this does create a bias, what is the risk? Is the conflict of interest the most important problem? Or are we pulling out the wrong piece? Is that the wrong starting point? What other issues exist? What constitutes a conflict of interest? I think we need to be clear in defining the problem. Should conflicts of interest be disclosed? And if so, how? And I would also add, by whom? Is disclosure of conflicts of interest enough to protect the patient, to protect the physician, to maintain professional integrity? Or is there something more we need to think about? What other guidelines are needed? Again, if the ones we already have aren't sufficient, what else do we need? Do we need an enforcement mechanism for those guidelines? Is it enough to be self-policing? Or do we need other levers of enforcement? And who is responsible for identifying and addressing the problems? Should it take a conference like this, or are we all responsible? And who's responsible for enforcing the guidelines, assuming we agree they should be enforced? Here's my hope for today. Now, wasn't that nice? We talked, we agreed on some things, we disagreed on some things, but no one threatened to sue anybody. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. That was great. I'd like to start now the first session, which will be about medical devices. And Dr. Stuart Green will be the first to start. Dr. Green will be starting with really a historical view of medical conflicts of interest, because he is, aside from a clinical professor of orthopedic surgery, he is a historian. He's written numerous articles about Benjamin Franklin in the Federalist period. In fact, he just recently published a book about Benjamin Franklin. And I thought he would put this in a good perspective. He is a pioneer in his own right. Dr. Green brought from Kurgan, Russia, 20 years ago, the Ilitsatov leg lengthening device, which has since become used for fractures, non-unions, different medical things. It's become a standard of care, actually. And he was the first to bring it to this country and do it here. And I remember when it was on the cover of Time magazine, actually, 20 years ago. And so I would like to introduce Dr. Stuart Green.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. And the previous speaker mentioned theological issues briefly, and I just want to tell you, Chuck, this is the first meeting that I've ever been to in my life where bacon, eggs, Benedict, and cheese blintzes have been served right next to each other. So I think from that perspective, this talk is going to be, and the meeting is going to be very ecumenical, if nothing else. Which is the one that moves us forward? Got it. Okay. The presentation I'm going to provide is based on a number of papers that I've published in clinical orthopedics over the years, including Orthopedic Surgeons and Inheritors of Tradition, The Evolution of Medical Technology, The Origin of Modern Clinical Research, and finally, Surgeons and Shamans, The Placebo Value of Ritual. We're going to be focusing primarily also, by the way, the book on Franklin. We're going to be focusing primarily on the article on the evolution of medical technology, Lessons from the Burgess Shale. The story starts here in Western Canada at the Burgess Shale, a shale quarry that was created 1.5 billion years ago when a mudslide trapped a number of soft-bodied organisms in the water. When these shale pieces were broken apart, the creatures that came out were rather peculiar looking. For example, one that had 5 eyes and a claw at the end of its nose, another that had 7 pairs of appendages, And the scientists couldn't really understand which phyla these belonged into and created their own separate phyla for each of these kinds of creatures because there's no modern version of them that exists or anything close to these things. And the question was, where did they fit into the so-called cone of diversity that we ordinarily associate with evolution? It turns out there is no cone of diversity. What really happens is this situation, diversity and decimation. There are a number of different forms that exist that become extinct. This occurs in what's called an empty landscape environment. In the Cambrian period, when these creatures first came into being, there were no multicellular creatures, only single-cellular creatures. And what happened is nature tried a number of different experiments, and only those that had the most successful body designs are the ones that led to further developments in life. This is one of the fundamental principles. It's called diversity and decimation. Stephen Jay Gould, in his book, Wonderful Life, says that this is a characteristic feature of all empty landscape biological systems. Stuart Kaufman, who's a systems guy, said that it is the feature of all complex systems involving in an empty landscape environment. For example, the automobile, when it first came about, had very peculiar forms, and so did computer operating systems. I mean, recall there was the Radio Shack had their own, Compaq had their own, all these different, and only two have survived, really, DOS and Apple system. And I thought, gee, this is really interesting because total knee replacement came about in the same sort of way. The total hip was invented by John Charnley in the 1960s, and people said, gee, maybe we could do the same thing with a knee. And so there was an empty landscape, and lots of people simultaneously tried to create something new, a medical device that would work for arthritic knees. And some of the early gadgets were rather peculiar looking by our modern standards. This is called the Gunston. This is one of the first ones. Two runners to substitute for the condyles. They were glued in. The Waldius, a hinge device. These other hinge devices, all with fixed hinges. And of course, within a year or two, these things worked loose, became infected, and there were tremendous problems with these devices. The Herbert, I'll talk to you about that because that's one that one of my partners had some experience with. This goofy looking thing, two polyethylene plugs were put into the femur. That gadget was somehow jammed in there, and this piece went down into the tibia, the long stem, cemented in. These things worked loose within a year or two. Other incredibly bizarre-looking implants. The single most profitable invention from the University of California, Irvine, was the UCI knee. This was actually the first one that actually looked like a knee. Okay? The authors wrote, analysis of the first 25 patients suggests a total knee prosthesis of Irvine, parentheses UCI design, may be inserted without the need of more than average precision and technique. Despite a wide range of patient size, it is not necessary to have more than one prosthesis. One size fits all. Was the Zimmer guy here somewhere? This company is now making, the precision of sizing turns out to be very critical. But anyway, this is what they said. The preoperative range of motion is generally exceeded. The average patient has been dramatically improved, and the knee is almost always converted from a painful to a painless joint. The most profitable patent this university ever had. Now, of course, all the total knees look like a natural knee. There was a kind of convergent evolution. All these other ones fell by the wayside. I made an evolutionary tree, and X's are extinct forms. Okay, 1970, 1980, 1990. You can see all the ones that exist today look like a human knee joint. Okay, here's the UCI knee down over here, one of the grandfathers of the whole process. So the question is, how is it that these things come about, and what happens to them? I mean, where do they go? And what I want to look at first is the reason they come about as a result of marketing pressures. When a designer comes to a company and says, let's make this thing, the company kind of grinds it out, the guy starts to put them in, and now the company wants to see some results. And so does the doctor, by the way, who has a vested interest, oftentimes in the implant, because his name is associated with it. There's a short follow-up, which is critical in this process, because all these things work for the first year or two. I mean, they're cemented in, and it takes that long for the cement to work loose. And then, of course, what I call developer enthusiasm. The developer is intensely involved in the product. I mean, for lots of different reasons. First of all, everybody wants to be the smartest kid on the block. If the device is successful, then millions of people around the world will say, I've got a gupta in my knee, or I've got a gupta in my carpal tunnel. And who doesn't want that? I mean, you're like Jonas Salk, but if this thing actually works out well. You might win the Nobel Prize. And of course, this issue, something we'll be talking and hearing a lot about. Developer enthusiasm, however, causes a certain distortion of the preliminary data. Earliest cases are eliminated for what's called the learning curve. Subjective outcome criteria are often used. In other words, the patient is asked, well, actually the patient isn't asked, how are you doing? The doctor says, oh, you're doing great, aren't you? Short follow-up, as I mentioned earlier, and then bad outcomes are lost to follow-up. And I'm going to go into that with a specific example towards the end of the presentation. There's something else going on that very few people talk about. And that is, I believe that the selection criteria starts with picking the patient for the implant. And I know about this because one of my own partners is developing a total ankle, and he started 10 years ago, and he's only put just a few in. And I see him still doing ankle fusions, and I ask him, why are you doing this? I mean, you've got this product you're working on. He says, oh, that guy's a flake, and that one's workers' comp, and that one's this, and that one's that. He is selecting cases that will likely have a good outcome. And I think what happens is there is a subconscious meeting of the mind between the surgeon and the patient. The surgeon somehow conveys to the patient an expectation that you're going to do well, and the patient responds to this. And the surgeon is not going to pick patients where he feels a kind of psychological block, a skepticism, a likely bad outcome, when the surgeon is also the developer and has a vested interest in the outcome. I mean, this is something that I personally perceive of. It's happened in my own experience, because as you'll notice in the thing, I get about $50,000 from Smith & Nephew for a product. And I guarantee you this is what I did when I picked my patients. Loosening and totally replaced what I put it into a search engine and counted the number of articles per 3 years. And look what happened. This is the loosening. That is why these things fail. Okay? These guys out over here who are reporting vast 50, 60 articles about loosening of these implants are not the same guys as the developers. They're people without a vested interest. They're different people. They're people who are taking this product when it's on the market already and reporting bad outcomes. And you go back and you ask the developers, the champions back over here, well, you know, how come you didn't report this? Oh, we don't even use that device anymore. We're into Mark II now. We're in Mark III. We're in the 3rd version of it. They just switch for the same reasons that these guys have discovered. These guys discover, after all, with their follow-up, if they're honest with themselves. Charles Eng, a pioneering developer of total hips, was very discouraged with the way in which he pushed the so-called screw-in acetabulum. He said, we can expect all the earliest reports of a new design to be glowing and written by the designers and champions. When a longer-term empiric outcomes are less than rosy, the next wave of reports is written by individuals who are more objective because they are not directly linked to the design, meaning no vested interest in the design itself. He said, because surgeons sell to other surgeons best, companies need surgeon champions who truly believe in the features of their products. That's how he put it. This Herbert prosthesis, again, this is out of France. Actually, I should say Hébert is the correct way to say it. The two that my partner did both ended up in amputation of the leg. And in fact, one of the series reported of 13 that were put in, 8 ended up in amputation, and the others ended up in massive revisions, knee fusions, and so forth. And this is basically what we're talking about here. Failure of a design that seems like a good idea at one point in time when it was first created. So the question is, what was the government's role in regulating the marketing of such devices?